The topic is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we're talking to Professor Baldwin from Vanderbilt University dealing with this very, very important act. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, before we had our first commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to further expand upon the Act of 1964. And I think one of the most important developments in reference to that has to do with the so-called political climate.
That's right.
If you could sort of put that in some kind of perspective for us.
Yeah, I think we have to first understand that there was a direct connection between civil rights protests of the 60s and the effort to pass a civil rights bill. Many scholars argue that Dr. King and SCLC's demonstrations that were led in the early 60s sort of helped create the political climate for the Civil Rights Act. But I think Roy Wilkins of the NAACP put it best when he said that if you're going to understand how this political climate was created, you have to go beyond SCLC and Dr. King to look at the sit-ins, the freedom rides in 1960-61, to look at the swim-ins that were occurring in St. Augustine, Florida, to look at some of the other civil rights protests across the South, that all of this sort of created the impetus for the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
You know, when you talk about the freedom rides, Dr. Baldwin, many young people might not understand exactly what these rides were all about. But I think more important, they might not understand the sort of courage that it took to become involved in what is known as the Freedom Ride. Talk about it from that perspective.
Well, the Freedom Rides occurred in the period 1960 up to 1961. It involved students boarding buses in Washington, D.C., black and white, black students sitting at the front, white students sitting at the back of the bus, rather. And they would ride from Washington, D.C. to various points in the South to protest bus segregation and segregation in interstate travel. So you're quite right in saying that it took a lot of courage for students to move into parts of the South on buses, black students sitting at the front, white students at the back of the bus, protesting segregation. Many students were brutalized, beaten. But I think we have to see the sit-ins, of course, as having contributed immensely to the kind of political climate that made possible the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
You know, I think somebody once remarked that in reality, all of the sit-ins were done, and as a matter of fact, I think you might have made this comment, that in a real sense it was the students who sort of guided that civil rights movement in a real sense through the sit-ins and et cetera.
And the freedom rides.
And freedom rides.
Yes,
Speak to it.
Very much so. I think that's one of the problems in scholarship on the historiography of the civil rights movement is that the roles of students have been pretty much ignored by scholars. David Halberstam has dealt with it in a book called The Children, and of course John Lewis wrote a book called Walking with the Wind, and they take into account the roles of students. But that part has been ignored. Largely, the focus has been on Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the role of clergy and the churches in the movement. And undoubtedly, churches, clergymen, leaders like King did a lot in terms of helping create that climate, but I think we need to take into account also the courage and the contributions and the commitment of students.
And these students were really on the front line. They were in reality were the troops of, in a real sense, the civil rights movement.
And unsung heroes in many ways.
Well, you know, Dr. Baldwin, when you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what could you say in reference to pulling all of this together? That is, all of the activity that has gone on dealing with civil rights and et cetera, and yet still, even today, we find that there are still some questions in reference to non-discrimination and those things.
Exactly. I think it speaks to the fact that the hopes and dreams and expectations that people had revolving around the Civil Rights Act of 1964 have not materialized. So we're still dealing with problems in terms of housing discrimination. We're still dealing with battles over civil rights legislation. We are still dealing with discrimination in other areas of American life, and also personal racism, not just institutional racism, but personal racism. So I think it speaks to the fact that I don't think it speaks well of the legacy of not only the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but civil rights legislation in general. Somehow or another, we have failed to implement the guidelines, the provisions set forth in these particular pieces of legislation. One other point I might add, I spoke earlier of the direct connection between the civil rights movement and the introduction of the Civil Rights Act. I think we have to also take into account the fact that the federal government helped create that climate, because the Johnson administration, President Lyndon Johnson, was determined to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress. And he met a lot of resistance from Southern Dixiecrats. But he, I think, figured prominently at that level. But once the Civil Rights Act was passed, the federal government, I think, began to retreat from its commitment. And, of course, the provisions of the Act have not, even up to this point, been fully implemented.
And so now, Dr. Baldwin, we are more than 40 years beyond the Act of 1964.
Right.
And I don't think that we can identify any civil rights legislation in a real sense that that would even come close to the Act of 1964.
Exactly.
Would you suggest that perhaps it might be time to revisit some of these things?
I think the time is there. Not only the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You're quite right in saying that we're now beyond the 40th anniversary. I think July 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, introduced and passed. But you're quite right. I think we need to revisit these pieces of legislation and to see where we went wrong, see what hasn't been done right up to this point, and perhaps expand on these pieces of civil rights legislation, or perhaps to create new pieces of legislation to address the economic realities that we face in American society today. I think the problem of civil rights, we have civil rights, basic constitutional rights, but the problem is the lack of economic justice, which was the last part of Dr. King's crusade. He was involved in that when he was killed. We need civil rights legislation to address, to go beyond 1964, to deal not only with employment opportunities, job discrimination, but to deal with the whole question of how to bring about economic equality.
Okay, and of course what we'll do, we'll talk about that when we return following this short commercial break. The topic is